can't believe I'm playing video games with Bart Simpson. I sketched you so many times in my dream journal.
Can you have a falling out with a friend who doesn't really exist? Many of us feel that we know media figures or characters despite never meeting them, or even if they're completely fictitious. And if the outrage that has erupted over the dissatisfaction with many recent films and television programs such as Star Wars or Game of Thrones is any indication, people can be very passionate about media characters and worlds. How do we see these characters, and how do they affect us psychologically and emotionally? How do we react when these relationships we experience with fictional figures end, be it via their death or the cancellation of a series? If we see these characters as friends, how are we affected when we feel betrayed by them? And how should justice be served to people who don't really exist? Do we all really want a happy ending for our favorite narratives and our favorite characters, or do we want a meaningful one? Today, let's explore all of these questions and ultimately ask the biggest one of all. Why was the Star Wars sequel trilogy such a massive, gigantic flop? But first, let me tell you about this video's sponsor, NordLocker. NordLocker is a file encryption service that allows you to store your files safely and securely, but easily accessible to you and you only, or anyone who you choose to give access to. For the things that matter most to you, be they work documents, medical information, financial information, videos, or pictures, security for your personal data is more important now than ever. And with NordLocker, you get just that. With their zero-knowledge privacy and state-of-the-art cryptography, NordLocker ensures that your elaborate collection of rare pepes will remain for your eyes only, as it should be. From your passwords and ID information to pictures and memories to work-related projects, you can rest assured that your information is only shared with the people you want to share it with, and you can take it with you anywhere. NordLocker adds an extra layer of security over cloud services like Google Drive and Dropbox, and it's super easy to use. Just drag and drop. There are no file size limits or limits on how many files you can encrypt, and it works on both Mac and PC. Either for your business or personal use, you can ensure that your files are protected by clicking the link in my description and getting 37% off a 1-year plan with NordLocker. And enter the code AYDIN, that's AYDIN, to get an extra 5% off. Not sure if NordLocker is right for you? No problem, because not only is there a 30-day money-back guarantee, but you can download a free trial of the software and try before you buy. So check out NordLocker and upload your totally legitimate copy of The Rise of Skywalker completely privately and protected, because really, do you want people knowing that you watched that dumpster fire? So with that out of the way, let's start our deep dive into said dumpster by talking about the psychology of parasocial relationships. Just what is a parasocial relationship? Well, parasocial relationships are simply the relationships that we form with fictional characters or media figures that we feel close to, despite often never having any face-to-face personal interaction with that personality. While social media has made it possible for all of us to potentially contact our favorite celebrities to a greater degree than probably ever before, when it comes to fictional characters, obviously there's no way for us to have a real relationship with them as they just don't exist.
It's fiction. It's fiction. We made it up. We made this one up. It's a made-up tale.
Our brains aren't really good, though, at delineating this difference, and we often view fictional characters almost identically to the way we view our real-life friends. Much as with friendships, our parasocial relationships affect us emotionally and also provide us something of value, hence why we have a vested interest in media figures, be they real people or completely fictitious. As bizarre as it might sound, we may be just as satisfied from our relationships with fictional personalities as we are with actual people. As Branch Wilson and Agnew 2013 studied parasocial relationships people experience with a celebrity, including people like Lauren Conrad and Ellen DeGeneres, and with fictional characters, including Blair Waldorf from Gossip Girl and Gregory House of House MD. The more committed people were to the fictional character, the more satisfaction they felt from this relationship, and the more invested they were in spending time engaging with the parasocial interaction with the character, and vice versa. This is investment theory. In other words, particularly when we are invested in a character and that investment provides us with satisfaction, we tend to become committed to these fictional characters much as we would with real-life friends. When participants were asked about alternatives to this parasocial relationship, such as watching a different program, interacting with their real-life friends, or just not consuming any entertainment media, those who chose to have no interaction as an alternative option were the lowest in commitment, unsurprisingly. But there was very little effect in those who said they would like to instead watch a different program or interact with their friends outside of the media context. as unlike romantic relationships, parasocial relationships don't have any expectation of exclusivity. Thus, commitment is lower when we feel as if we don't have any other options and characters to interact with parasocially. We don't feel as if we're cheating on our parasocial friendships by watching another television show.
That's right.
Did you throw his body pillow off the map?
No, he did. No, he didn't. He jumped off.
Joey.
There, yeah. You got a picture of me on a body pillow. Are you happy now?
Compared to celebrities, while people reported slightly lower average commitment and investment in the fictional figures, they were slightly, albeit non-significantly, more satisfied by their interaction with the fictitious characters in comparison to celebrities. Again, people who said that they would consider completely cutting media out of their life expressed lowered commitment for the fictional characters, but only the fictional characters. This is likely because our only method of interacting with a fictional character is through traditional media. While we can read about a celebrity's life in a tabloid, see them posting on social media, or maybe even hunt them down and take creepy photos of them if you have, that kind of parasocial relationship with them. You can't do that with a fictional character, unless you end up in some kind of weird isekai situation, of course. In contrast to the people who said that they would be willing to cut media out of their lives, those who said they were very unlikely to stop consuming entertainment media were actually much more committed to the fictional characters than they were to celebrities. As again, for fictional characters, turning off the television means terminating the parasocial relationship. Other than satisfaction and a feeling of friendship though, what else do we get out of these relationships that would cause us to pursue and maintain them? Coderre 2015 looked at the psychological correlates to having a strong parasocial relationship with a media figure, be they an actor or a character. In this study, participants were asked questions about their personality as well as how strongly they felt about their favorite actor or media figure in general. The psychological traits assessed were loneliness, social anxiety, and attachment style. In this case, attachment style was broken down into closeness attachment, which is the degree to which one feels comfortable being close to others, dependent attachment, which is the degree to which one feels comfortable depending on others, and anxious attachment, which is the degree to which one worries about being rejected by others. Contrary to their expectations, Coderre found that the strength of a parasocial relationship was negatively related to both loneliness and social anxiety. These relationships were positively, although non-significantly, related to all of the attachment styles, but most strongly with close attachment, being willing to feel close to others. Additionally, these parasocial relationships were positively and significantly related to how much people watched media with others and then discussed said media with others. There were some differences, however, when relationships with different types of media figures were broken down by the media type involved. Specifically, in the case of musicians, while a strong relationship with other media figures was related to low dependent attachment, a strong relationship with a musician was related to greater senses of dependency. Stronger relationships with TV or reality stars, live action stars, or animated fictional characters, musicians, and athletes were all related to slightly more closeness attachment compared to other categories, which predominantly in these cases were parasocial relationships with actors or actresses. In other words, unlike being close to an actor who plays a character, we might feel more close attachment style when we're talking about a fictional character. When it comes to the effects of watching and discussing media with others, people with strong parasocial relationships who didn't talk about media with other people were more prone to have an anxious attachment style. And while there were similar trends in those who did discuss media with others, it was far less dramatic than those who kept their opinions to themselves. People with strong media attachments who were cohabitating with a romantic partner were much less socially anxious, but were slightly more likely to have an anxious attachment style than those who were not cohabitating. Interestingly, having these parasocial relationships seemingly serves as a kind of parapet against loneliness in those who were not cohabitating, who reported less loneliness when they also had a strong parasocial connection to a media figure and possessed a greater dependent attachment style, being more willing to be dependent on others. What all of this means is that people who care very strongly about media characters and figures, perhaps more so than just being interested in actors and celebrities, are really not lonely loser nerd man babies, but instead having these strong parasocial links may actually make us less lonely, less socially anxious, and more likely to have secure attachment styles than those of us who lack these strong connections with fictional figures, regardless of whether or not we have a romantic partner. Specifically, this effect seems most potent when people talk about media with others and share their opinions.
Creed sucks! I hate you! And I hate the bands you like!
Fans being passionate about their favorite character or their favorite media figure is therefore not inherently toxic, but instead quite the opposite. It's potentially psychologically helpful and healthy. These characters mean something to people on an emotional and a psychological level. And while these are just correlations, not causal linkages, it indicates that people who have strong parasocial relationships with media figures are likely less lonely and less socially anxious than those who do not, even if they really are single guys actually living alone in their mom's basement. The truth is, we see our parasocial friends as very real, and as such, we react to them psychologically and emotionally similarly to any other friendship, including when it concerns the death or termination of that friendship. For example, De Groot and Lath examined the behavior of fans of House MD following the abrupt of the character Lawrence Kuttner, who had been a member of the show's main cast for about 4 seasons at that point. In response, fans created a memorial Facebook page for the character, and the things they posted mirrored similar memorial pages that were made in the wake of the deaths of actual real people, with some expressing sadness, shock, longing, and love, while others being legitimately confused if the actor had died and not just the character. They reminisced about their favorite memories and even engaged in coping behaviors, getting angry at the show writers and advocating instead for the deaths of other characters in his place. Beyond the similarities in emotional response, the death of a media figure can even produce behavioral changes in us, as Cohen and Hoffner 2006 found an increase in people sharing mental health information following the of Robin Williams, which was directly related to the degree to which they felt parasocially close to the actor and comedian, but also mediated through the degree of grief they felt following his passing. Unsurprisingly, the more close people felt to Williams, the more grief they felt, and the more grief they felt, the more likely they were to share mental health information online. This was particularly more potent and more likely when people sought to seek some positive meaning-making out of the loss of the beloved star. So, given that we react similarly to parasocial relationships as we do real-life friendships, psychologically and emotionally, what do we do when these relationships inevitably end? A unique aspect of parasocial relationships and their emotional effect on us is that these relationships can be dissolved without any actual death, even within the narrative, as eventually even the most popular of franchises will inevitably and hopefully end, and often in an unsatisfying manner.
Such a lust for revenge! Yeah, rip.
While we're all mortal and all of our favorite celebrities and creators will eventually pass, media stories are the product of the work usually of many people and can end abruptly at any point in time for any number of reasons, and given our only connection to a fictional character is through media, our relationships with them are always at risk of being quickly dissolved with a cancellation or even just a hiatus. Cohen 2003 described this as parasocial breakup, and asked both adults and adolescents to think of their favorite media figures, be they real or fictitious, and imagine how they would feel if that figure was to no longer be around or if their show went off the air. High schoolers tended to have more parasocial interactions and felt a greater feeling of loss when imagining a parasocial breakup than adults did. Women in general, both adult and adolescent, tended to be more attached to their parasocial partners. Young women experienced more feelings of sadness from the parasocial breakup than did any other group. But we don't just have to look at how people imagine they might feel when a character they care about is taken away, we have data on how it actually affects us, as illustrated by Lather and Moyer-Goose 2011, who examined reactions to the Hollywood writers' strike of 2007 through 2008, which caused many of the most popular television shows of the time to go off air or go off air at least sporadically.
Because you see, you're here forever.
They measured feelings of parasocial breakup distress, which included items such as feeling a void in one's life, or feeling lonely without their favorite character's presence. They found that people who were more fond of television in general also had stronger parasocial relationships, and were more likely to experience these deleterious psychological effects of sadness or loneliness. While women tended to have stronger parasocial relationships, there was no difference between the sexes in their tendency to feel this distress. The only major sex difference was in coping mechanisms, as women were significantly more likely than men to hang out with friends to compensate for the parasocial breakup. The most common methods of dealing with distress for both sexes, however, were watching reruns and using the internet, likely in part to talk about the show with others. In their full model, they found that people who watch television for companionship reasons, which we've seen people receive from parasocial interaction, tend to have stronger parasocial relationships and subsequently feel greater distress following a parasocial breakup. In short, parasocial relationships matter to us, They provide positive effects on our psyche, and we react with sadness, loneliness, and distress when they are terminated, or even just put in potential danger. So it's no wonder why people get a little bit upset when that relationship is damaged in some way. Obviously, a cancellation terminates the relationship, but if parasocial relationships are really so similar to friendships, that means that we, the viewers, are just as capable of choosing to terminate the relationship ourselves when we feel wronged by our parasocial partners, right? Is it really so different as a betrayal from a friend if the positive benefits of personal friendships are reflected in parasocial ones? Because we experience these relationships psychologically similarly to friendships, it makes sense then that a violation of that relationship will be perceived similarly as well, and research has illustrated as such, as Cohen 2010 examined the concept of parasocial breakup in comparison to real-life friendship breakup. She asked participants to think of a real-life friendship and a media figure that they felt close to, and asked them to consider scenarios wherein these people behaved in ways that would likely be seen as negative, including a potential trust violation, such as lying or breaking a promise, a social violation, such as making mean or inappropriate comments, and moral violations of varying degrees of severity, with a minor moral violation including things like cheating on taxes, and a major moral violation including things like driving under the influence, or I don't know.
Please. Wake up!
Hey, stop! Why?
For trust infractions, participants reported greater violation, producing a decreased feeling of closeness when it concerned their real-life friends. But for every single other violation, people were much more offended when a media figure committed the supposed violation. That is, people feel more betrayed when they think about their favorite characters or actors acting in an immoral or antisocial way than they do when they think about their actual friends behaving in a similar fashion. Not all people were equally affected by violations from their friends, parasocial or otherwise, though. Women were much more affected by all forms of transgression than men were, and felt considerably less closeness towards either a friend or a media figure after considering a potential violation. The severity of reduction in feelings of closeness were also not equal across all types of media figures, as major moral violations such as cocaine use was seen as much more severe for a sports star than an actor, singer, or TV host. While there were some other small differences between other types of violations and media status, they failed to reach statistical significance. This is likely because professional athletes are seen as role models for children. Thus, we can extrapolate that characters that are seen as role models are also likely to be judged more harshly than those that are not seen as a hero for kids. How this affects media enjoyment and perceptions when actors portray characters was studied by Hugh 2016, who looked at how people felt about a film versus a talk show appearance after reading a fake news report about a moral violation from an actor, in this case George Clooney, who was stated to have assaulted his girlfriend in the fake report. Participants who read about the scandal and then watched a clip from the film Intolerable Cruelty starring Clooney expressed less closeness and interaction with Clooney's character in the film, as well as a greater feeling of betrayal from the actor than those who just watched the movie without reading the news article. Those who read about the scandal and then watched an interview with David Letterman and Clooney had similarly decreased parasocial closeness, but also expressed greater feelings of betrayal than those who watched the film over the interview clip. Women, again, reported feeling less close to Clooney after reading about the scandal than men did, and also felt more betrayed. Interestingly though, the people who reported no connection between their parasocial relationship and their parasocial interaction with Clooney were those who just watched a clip of the film and read nothing about the moral violation, with the strongest connection between feelings of closeness and interaction occurring for those who also avoided the scandal but watched the interview clip rather than the film clip. In other words, people who watched the movie without reading about the scandal didn't really feel as if they had interacted with George Clooney, but those who watched the talk show did. To put this all into perspective, we can view media figures and the actors that play them as our friends, and as such, when they majorly violate our expectations of them, we feel upset, potentially even more upset than we do when our real-life friends betray us. Interestingly, while knowing about real-life scandals of the actors behind the characters and seeing them in a more human environment may make us feel more interaction with them, it doesn't produce more positive feelings when we feel wronged by that person, or perhaps even the characters they portray. We are particularly sensitive when it concerns characters that are seen as role models, particularly role models to children. But if these breakups and violations are so powerful, how do we establish the relationships in the first place? And how do we set the tone for our expectations of how media figures should behave? Much as with face-to-face relationships, first impressions matter. This is called the primacy effect, in that information we receive first tends to often be the most salient. When a character or a friend behaves in a way which is inconsistent with our expectations based on our initial perceptions, this violation can produce cognitive dissonance regarding our opinions toward them. Cognitive dissonance is a state of psychological discomfort that we will always seek to alleviate. Someone we once trust has acted immorally. That makes us question why we liked them in the first place, and as a result, as Fisklin and Newberg 2009 and further Sanders 2010 present us with models of potential outcomes and methods of coping with these violations from our friends, be they parasocial or real world. First, we make an initial assessment of the attributes another person possesses. Next, we seek confirming information to reassure us of the validity of our original assessment. However, if we are unable to confirm this assessment, then we are forced to reassess our initial beliefs. While the human brain is incredibly complex, we are also cognitive misers, due in large part to the huge energy expenditure that our big galaxy brains consume, and as a result, we tend to defer to cognitive heuristics and simple categorizations for people. Sure, we all know that deep down people are complicated, but it's easier to place them into generalized boxes, or categories, for the sake of simplicity. Thus, if our initial categorization of someone as good or kind is contradicted, we may then want to recategorize that person as bad or evil when our expectations are violated. However, if the initial perception, which tends to be more salient via the primacy effect, is particularly strong, we may avoid recategorizing the person based on a single inconsistency. At this point, we would come to view a person with more concern towards their unique, individual attributes, rather than sorting them into an easy or simple category of good or bad, hero or villain, or any number of labels. This is how we form our disposition towards characters and people alike, hence why this is called disposition theory. To explicate this process, let's consider one of my favorite media characters and one who's already been mentioned several times today. That's Dr. Gregory House. If you're familiar with the eponymous program House, try to pretend you're not for the purpose of this thought experiment, and that you're completely unfamiliar with the character. Sitting down to watch the pilot episode, we are introduced to a man described as a brilliant doctor. Immediately, with the word doctor, we have a category. Now, while I'm sure many of you have personally bad experiences with medical professionals, we consider what a doctor is as a broad category, particularly in the media. A doctor is someone who is caring, kind, someone who is dedicated to helping others. So here we have our primacy information. House is a doctor and doctors are kind, therefore we quickly apply those attributes to House. But when we actually get to meet Dr. House, he's a cantankerous, rude smartass with absolutely no bedside manner. He views his patients as puzzles, not as people, and flaunts his addiction to powerful narcotics while on the job. Here we have some violations, and thus a recategorization of who House is can occur. House violates our expectations of a doctor, so now the viewer must consider what he is.
Sweet is kindly, but that is not his name. Audrey is sweet, but she is not your doctor.
As the pilot episode continues, we learn more about House's own personal struggles that serve as something of an excuse for some of his more negative behavior. Thus, if the show's success is any indication, the prime categorization with the additional information about House's background causes him to be judged by the viewer based more on his individual attributes than by his ability to fit neatly into a heuristic box or category. This is a large part of what makes characters like House or Walter White or Tony Soprano so beloved and attain a cult-like following of people who feel they have a very real parasocial relationship with them. The key here, though, is that severe violations are difficult to recover from and lead to parasocial breakup, as we've seen. When developing Breaking Bad, director Vince Gilligan described the character of Walter White as a slow transformation from Mr. Chips to Scarface, and the reason so many people stuck with Walter's character and continue to root for him is because the violations escalated slowly over time. We are introduced to Walter White as a passionate, brilliant, but disrespected high school teacher and a loving family man. Thus, when he's diagnosed with cancer and turns to producing drugs to pay for his own funeral and provide for his family in the future, this violation is minor enough to prevent us from recategorizing Walter White as a bad person and instead not only hold on to our initial perceptions of him, but also base our continual perceptions of the character based on complex considerations of his various attributes, rather than a simple heuristic category he can be neatly placed in. This continual attributional deference that the viewer gives to Walter causes the viewer to often fall back on their prime introduction or to the character's behavior in the earlier seasons, even as he becomes a child-poisoning homicidal crime lord. What all of this means is that we are very willing to forgive and forget the misdeeds of our friends, be they real or parasocial, provided we are not basing our understanding of a person or character on broad categories, but rather on his or her individuating attributes. Due to our psychological desire, nay need, to maintain internal consistency and avoid dissonance, we will excuse sometimes reprehensible behavior from others because they are our friends, and we know them, seemingly so long as the violations occur slowly or given seeming rationales.
I hope you get cancer. I really do. Well, my parents were mean to me.
Of course, this does not apply to all people all the time. Some people became disgusted with Walter White long before he became a true monster, but plenty of others say the entire city of Albuquerque held a funeral parade in honor of the character's death, wherein over 200 people showed up to publicly mourn his fictional passing. While I would say for book readers, Daenerys Targaryen going full Mad Targ is something a lot of us are expecting in future installments based on her tyrannical actions in the books.
Sunset found her squatting in the grass, groaning.
One of the reasons I believe the last season of Game of Thrones generated such ire is precisely because the show consistently depicted Daenerys as a hero, a savior, a kind person, and thus her decision to suddenly murder thousands of civilians for no apparent reason is a violation so severe, not a slow violation or one based on a series of increasing violations or even based on logical rationales, as to prove impossible for anything but recategorization of Dany as a villain to occur in the minds of most viewers. This same can go for former villains who turn heel and become good guys. While certainly there are countless examples in shonen anime and manga, some of the most effective heel turns are those that similarly build over time, with rationales built into the plot or the narrative. For example, Spike from Buffy the Vampire Slayer being introduced as a pure villain who likes to torture people with railroad spikes and has a notch of dead slayers on his belt, but over the course of 4 seasons slowly becomes not only a main part of the protagonist cast, but is arguably the true hero of the show's finale. The point is, we are more than willing to accept changes in a character, but they need to be done either slowly or in a way that makes logical sense within a narrative. You can turn a beloved character into a villain or a villain into a hero, but you have to do it in a way that the audience perceives of as somewhat consistent based on primacy information. And just, what makes sense. Violating expectations without rationale will only produce recategorization and result in parasocial breakup. But how can we forgive characters who have transgressed against us? As a product of how we form our dispositions towards media figures, we're willing to take a lot of bad behavior before we abandon a friend, because how can we abandon a friend? But we have more evidence to show just how this manifests based on existing opinions toward an actor or a character. Hugh et al., 2018, examined just how offended people were by a transgression by a media figure that was generally more well-liked or disliked by the public. In this case, participants were given 2 fake news articles about either George Clooney, who the participants generally had more positive opinions toward, and Charlie Sheen, who they tended to have more negative opinions toward. Gee, I can't imagine why.
Tiger blood, Adonis DNA. You, booger blood, poo-poo DNA.
The false reports claimed the actor had recently committed either a major or minor moral violation. The minor violation involved the actor accidentally hitting a bystander in the face with a door while leaving a bar in a hurry, while the major violation involved the actor skipping to the front of the line at a bar and then yeeting the absolute shit out of a bystander who complained about the behavior. After reading the news, reported liking of Clooney decreased much more so than did liking of Sheen, who began at a lower baseline. Clooney was seen as less responsible in general for either transgression than Sheen was, but there was an interesting gender effect. Women viewed Clooney as more responsible than men did, but men viewed Sheen as more responsible than women did. Feelings of parasocial breakup were fairly similar, with women feeling less betrayed by either actor than men did, but with fairly similar results for both Clooney and Sheen across the sexes concerning feelings of betrayal. Men and women were much more likely to forgive Clooney, and women were particularly unforgiving of Charlie Sheen. The severity of the transgressions also mattered here. For Sheen, the minor transgression didn't affect the parasocial relationships with the actor at all, but the major transgression did somewhat reduce feelings of closeness. In contrast, the findings were much stronger for Clooney, in that participants experienced less parasocial closeness for both the minor and major moral violations, but particularly for the major violation, with a decrease in mean parasocial relationship scores of 0.44 points, the largest in the entire dataset. Ultimately, Clooney, the initially more well-liked actor, suffered far more from either form of transgression than did Sheen, who was less well-liked initially by participants. While participants were generally more likely to attribute the transgression internally to Sheen and were less likely to forgive him, their relationship with Sheen was generally unchanged after reading the news reports. Again, this is based in part on the severity of the violation, with the major violation receiving much less forgiveness and decreased parasocial closeness, producing more feelings of betrayal and much more internal attribution of actions. Overall, the existing degree of parasocial closeness a person feels towards a media figure after being exposed to negative information about them is positively related to forgiveness and negatively related to a tendency to attribute the behavior to the person rather than to the circumstances. And internal attribution was negatively related to forgiveness. What all of that means, though, is that because people are unlikely to decrease in their negative opinions toward a media figure they don't already feel close to, it's only really their parasocial friends who are more likely to be overwhelmingly negatively perceived of as a product of a moral transgression. That is, if you already don't like a media figure, why would you care if they screw up? It's our friends that we care about, and while we may be more likely to forgive them in some instances, we're also more hurt when we feel that they have wronged us. The allegations surrounding the Bill Cosby case were so devastating because Cosby was seen by a generation of people as America's dad, whereas nobody really cares if Killer Keemstar says something untoward.
I had no idea that your feelings were being hurt, considering the fact that you only got feeling in 10% of your body.
Oh, my feelings? You don't have to worry about my feelings, bro. How about your hair, though?
The question is, can media figures repair their relationship with the public by making an apology? Once a media figure, be they an actor or character, has done something to violate our trust, is it possible to reverse course and fix the parasocial relationship? Another study from Hugh et al. 2019, using the same example of the more well-liked actor George Clooney, this time presented participants with a fabricated news article claiming the actor had been arrested for drunk driving, a major moral transgression. Some participants were told Clooney had since issued a public apology, fully acknowledging his actions, taking responsibility, expressing his remorse, making a commitment to compensate for the damages, and promising to never drive drunk again. Others were told Clooney had made no such statement. As before, both men and women experienced significantly decreased parasocial closeness with Clooney after reading the article, with both sexes being similarly emotionally affected by the news. However, women were much less accepting of Clooney's apology and were slightly less likely to forgive him for his actions than men were. Mothers Against Drunk Driving was a thing after all. While people experienced less decrease in parasocial closeness when the actor apologized, in aggregate, apologies did very little to rectify the actor's actions, with no average difference in emotional response nor propensity for forgiveness between the apology and non-apology conditions. That doesn't mean the apology made no difference, though, as the remaining parasocial closeness that people expressed and felt after reading the news article served as a mediator variable. People who still had a stronger parasocial relationship with Clooney after reading the article were more receptive of the apology, and being more receptive of the apology was related to greater capacity for forgiveness. What this means is that we can forgive characters or their actors for the wrongs that they have done. But for every wrongdoing, our parasocial closeness with that figure decreases, and as it decreases, we come to care less and less about any further transgressions they may commit. As previously explained, we are willing to accept our parasocial friends doing some pretty heinous crap when it's done slowly or when explications are provided for the behavior. We're willing to forgive characters based on how much we initially liked them, but when you continually destroy a character or a media figure, then they have no closeness left for us to latch onto which would facilitate our ability to forgive. In other words, the only figures really affected by transgressions are those that we actually care about. That doesn't mean we aren't capable of forgiving them, but when the transgression is major, it's likely to cause more of a parasocial breakup and therefore a decreased capacity for forgiveness, even when an apology is issued. Moreover, the data don't really indicate that an apology or stronger existing feelings of closeness fix the damaged parasocial relationship. It only provides a bit of a bulwark against the damage being done. If a character has done wrong then, does seeing them receive justice make us like media more or less? As we've seen, we can potentially forgive media figures for their transgressions, although our capacity for forgiveness is largely based on how much we still like them after we feel we've been betrayed. While the previous studies looked at just actors, we can apply a lot of this to fictional characters and narratives as well. With an actor or a sports star, obviously their transgressions have real-life, real-world implications, but as we've seen, we can experience parasocial breakup with fictional media figures as much as the actors who portray them. Is it possible for us to feel better when we see a character we believe has committed a transgression receive his or her just desserts then? Early media theory suggested that we ingest media because it makes us feel good. This is the hedonic principle. However, very quickly, media scholars came across the quandary of, well, if we use media to feel good, why then do we watch sad films or films with sad endings? There are many possible answers provided by media psychologists, including excitation transfer theory and mood management theory, and while I could spend a whole video and more or less have at different points in time discussing those theories, today I want to focus instead on a specific aspect of media usage as suggested by these scholars, and that is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia, unlike hedonia, is not pure happiness and enjoyment brought about by media consumption, but instead describes a feeling of meaningfulness or appreciation. This is the dual process model of media enjoyment and appreciation. While we may not enjoy seeing a sad ending, it doesn't make us happy, we may find it meaningful, perhaps particularly if we feel a character we once liked is being punished for a transgression that has violated our expectations or harmed our parasocial relationship with that character, rather than just purely seeing the wicked be punished. However, it is true, generally speaking, we tend to prefer happy endings to a tale, as Lewis et al. 2014 illustrates. In their initial study, they provided participants with 3 different endings to a story: a happy ending, a mixed ending, and a negative ending, all with different moral implications. In one example given, participants read a narrative about soldiers exterminating the inhabitants of a village, with a young mother, Ava, hiding out in the basement with several other survivors as her baby begins to cry, potentially giving away their location. In one ending, Ava's baby cries, revealing their position, and all of the villagers are killed. In the mixed ending, Ava covers her baby's mouth and the baby suffocates, but the rest of the group survives. In the final, the positive story, the group works together to comfort the baby and they all survive. People unilaterally preferred the happy ending, and kind of hated the extremely sad endings to these narratives. They also responded to the happy endings more quickly regarding their feelings than the mixed or negative ones. However, the time it takes for people to respond indicates that while they may not immediately like the sadder endings as much, those endings may be creating more meaning than just pure positivity. In a second study then, when eudaimonia was considered, the researchers found that while happiness was lower for the mixed endings, wherein some sacrifice or suffering was involved, appreciation was the highest. People most appreciated endings that were not just pure bliss, and instead appreciation was slightly lower when the ending was all sunshine and rainbows. We want our heroes to succeed and see villains be punished, but without stakes, without some form of sacrifice or suffering, these endings produce less meaning than those that end with some actual gravitas. We may like happy endings, but ultimately, we need to see our characters face adversity if we are to draw any substantial meaning from a narrative. The question then is, how do we feel about having characters we feel have betrayed us ultimately get a justified ending that punishes them for their transgressions, even if it means a beloved character potentially suffering? How should villains be punished and heroes be rewarded? Answers to these questions have recently been addressed by Grizzard et al. 2019, who looked at how much people enjoyed media when justice was distributed fairly or unfairly to characters within a narrative. Participants were given a story introduction and then saw one of 3 different outcomes to the story, in which the transgressor received excessive punishment, moderate punishment, or no punishment for their actions. Some of these stories involve very serious outcomes, including jail time and even potential homicide. Others were much more mundane or silly, broken down into 3 categories of severity between Group A, which included some really crazy crap, to Group C, which was fairly mild. So with that in mind, let's take a look at an example of one of these narratives as chosen via DM's choice.
Bill asked his neighbour, Luke, to house-sit whilst he was on a business trip. Luke decided to have some fun whilst house-sitting. He got really drunk watching television on Bill's couch. When Luke woke up, he found out that he had peed all over the couch whilst he was sleeping. Instead of cleaning it up, he just flipped the couch cushion over. Bill came home and figured out what had happened. Bill,
under retribution,
pretended not to notice the dirty couch and even paid Luke extra for house-sitting.
Equitable retribution,
took his dog to Luke's house where he let it pee on his couch.
Over retribution,
broke into Luke's car and smeared dog feces all over the seats and dashboard.
I want to be really clear, that is an actual example from this study, word for word. In terms of how people responded to these outcomes, participants liked the equitable redistributions of justice the most, and had somewhat equally less positive perceptions of both the under-redistributions, which are usually rather cuckish, let me be real, wherein the wronged party often does something nice for the transgressor, and the over-redistributions, although they did prefer the under-redistribution narratives slightly more. People also responded more quickly to the equitable endings than to the other endings, indicating that they perhaps took less time to emotionally process. In terms of eudaimonia, people most appreciated the under-retributive conditions, wherein, in most of the stories, the wronged character forgives or reacts with kindness towards the wrongdoer. In contrast, while people like the equitable outcomes the most, participants got the most enjoyment out of the over-retribution endings. What this all means is that people do want to see the bad see justice, and in fact, enjoy seeing them not only get what they deserve, but far more so. We like to see the bad guy suffer, excessively in some cases. However, what people find most poignant are meaningful messages that show the protagonist, who is the victim of a wrongdoing, being forgiving or lenient. We enjoy seeing the wicked be punished, but we don't necessarily report liking that more than seeing fair justice be done. Nor do we find extreme outcomes particularly meaningful. People tend to most like, although not enjoy, seeing the punishment fit the crime. There is a difference between liking and enjoying, after all.
Of course you love her. She's your wife. Yeah. I'm just saying, maybe you like me a bit more, that's all.
In toto, we tend to prefer forgiveness, then, over extreme retribution when it comes to justice in narratives. And taking this all together, when it comes to ending a story or perhaps a saga, people do want to see characters who have done wrong be punished. But while they may enjoy seeing them suffer as well, they tend to prefer fairness and tend to appreciate the protagonist instead being the bigger person. Thus, if a character has done wrong, while we might get a sadistic pleasure out of seeing their downfall, ultimately, we like and appreciate more positive outcomes when we also see justice being served. We also, at the same time, want to see our protagonists struggle. We may like seeing them succeed, sure, we may enjoy it, but we don't appreciate seeing happy endings that exist without any sacrifice. In short, yeah, we enjoy a happy ending, but we find fulfillment in endings that involve sacrifice, struggle, or even suffering. We get pleasure out of seeing a villain suffer, but we gain meaning from forgiveness and justice, and sometimes even seeing the hero suffer. I've explained all of these things because if it's not obvious at this point in the video, as I alluded to in the opening, I want to talk about everything that went wrong with the Star Wars sequel saga, and how both Ryan Roundhead Johnson and J.J. Abrams made major errors at almost every point, from The Force Awakens to The Last Jedi and certainly in The Rise of Skywalker, in its attempts at course correction. So let's take all of the data that we've looked at today and come to some conclusions about where, from a psychological and research-based perspective, these films went so wrong, from the character development, or lack thereof, to the moral violations of said characters, to the ending of the series. So with all of that in mind, let's discuss Star Wars. Unfortunately. Do I really need to explain the problems with the Star Wars sequels? I mean, from a narrative standpoint, obviously not. The Long Man and many other esteemed media critics online have done that job far more in depth than I have any desire to. But if you want to know more, I highly suggest any of the reviews from people like, just to name a few, Mauler, JXC, ER, or even Red Letter Media, although I think the latter there has been excessively lenient towards the same franchise that they gained popularity for absolutely ripping to pieces. No, what I wanted to do here was to explain the psychology behind why Star Wars not only failed, but why it managed to alienate seemingly absolutely everyone using the theories we've established today of parasocial relationships and interaction, investment theory, disposition theory, parasocial breakup, expectancy violation, eudaimonia, and proportional justice in narratives. In other words, this is not why people think they dislike Star Wars, but why their brains did. There are countless channels who have discussed at length the negative reaction of fans to the Skywalker saga, but let's look at why that reaction may have occurred from a psychological perspective, and luckily for us, we have a brand new study that gives us a look directly into why specifically The Last Jedi ruffled so many feathers. From Boris Matthews and Wolf, 2019. And yes, there will be spoilers for The Rise of Skywalker from this point out. The researchers measured participants' feelings of parasocial closeness to various characters both before and after watching The Last Jedi. While they expected that parasocial interaction would increase feelings of parasocial closeness with the heroes, they found that was not the case. The mean scores indicate that people felt considerably less close to Luke after watching the film and slightly more close to Kylo. Feelings of closeness towards Rey were non-significant, and that's actually very important. As they did expect, people liked Snoke less by the end of the movie, but their opinions on Leia were mostly unchanged. Specifically, there was a mean drop in feelings of love for Luke at a significant level of 0.25 points, and a mean significant increase for Kylo in terms of his communication skills of 0.23 points, and 0.22 points in their perceptions of his supportive qualities. In terms of morality, viewers saw Luke as more immoral on every single measure of the moral foundation's instrument, including authoritativeness, fairness, caring, loyalty, and purity. They viewed Leia as less authoritative, but viewed Kylo as more authoritative after watching the film. Interestingly, I'm sure to many who insist that everyone who disliked these films is a man-baby, gender had absolutely no impact on the change in parasocial closeness for any of the characters. However, time as a fan did. The longer someone had been a fan of the Star Wars franchise, the less they liked Rey and Snoke after watching the film. People generally just really despised the way that Luke acted in the movie and came to dislike his character as a result. Again, a lot of this was contrary to what the researchers were expecting, as viewers came to feel closer to Kylo and less close to Luke, despite Luke being a hero and Kylo supposedly being a villain. When they took expectancy into consideration, however, all of this starts to make sense. Viewers went into this movie expecting Luke to be a highly moral and likable figure, thus when his behaviors in the film violated their expectations, it resulted in lower reported parasocial relationship strength. While for Kylo, some of his actions seemed, I guess, more heroic than they did villainous, and while this is also a violation, it's a positive one that somewhat increased the strength of that parasocial relationship with the character. As we've discussed, when a character acts, well, out of character, it forces us to potentially engage in recategorization of who that character is, and therefore reassess how we feel about them. And the discrepancies between expectation and reality were greatest for Luke and Kylo. Although people did report Rey as being slightly more immoral than they expected and Snoke as being more moral than they expected. All of these violations of expectancy, ultimately though, created a very confused bunch of viewers, forced to cope with the cognitive dissonance and recategorization of characters that they thought they previously understood.
I'm so damn confused.
Given that cognitive dissonance is psychologically uncomfortable, excessively violating the expectations we have for characters is an unpleasant experience. This is not to say that people don't like seeing characters grow and change. However, the sharp, nonsensical changes made to many of the characters, particularly well-established characters like Luke Skywalker, do not cause people to consider his attributes, but rather to engage in recategorization to avoid that psychological discomfort. Disposition theory shows us that we are more than willing to excuse the behavior of characters if that behavior has a good rationale, if it makes sense with a character's various established attributes. However, when we are faced with contradictory information, this can only result in dissonance and recategorization of a previously understood character as something else than what we thought they were. Not only is this psychologically uncomfortable, it produces parasocial breakup, which in and of itself creates distress. Particularly when it concerns characters or media figures that we have a strong existing parasocial bond with. Seeing them behave immorally results in greater feelings of betrayal and a sharper decrease in feelings of closeness than those that we don't care about so much. Hence why there was very little to no change in people's parasocial relationships with Rey. Simply put, most people don't care enough about Rey to have a parasocial breakup with her. She doesn't have enough of a personality for anyone to have individuated her, and instead remains in this generic protagonist category. She doesn't have enough attributes for her to be considered more critically either, so with nothing else to care about. With no existing parasocial relationships, it's more difficult for her to violate our expectations when we don't have any expectations of her. Likely the reason people came to feel more parasocial closest to Kylo is because his expectancy violations are positive and allow us to consider him with more attributional individual ways, rather than under a simple villain category. Ultimately though, any growth that Kylo showed was too little to compensate for the feelings of betrayal produced by Luke's negative violations. And we know that this is particularly strong for a character like Luke, who is seen as a hero for children, and adults who grew up with the character as well. We've looked at how important and very real parasocial relationships are to us psychologically. So when a beloved character acts immorally and then is killed off, obviously this will produce distress. The outrage surrounding The Last Jedi is therefore completely rational and normal from a psychological perspective. For characters that we are invested in, particularly for heavier media consumers who are unlikely to stop watching, these relationships are satisfying. They make us feel less lonely, less socially anxious, and improve our psychological state. It is no surprise then that so many would be so incensed when they not only feel betrayed by their friend, but then are forced to watch that friend die unceremoniously.
You know, there are worse ways to go, but I can't think of a more undignified one than autoerotic asphyxiation.
Why are you telling me that?
In an attempt to restore faith with the audience in the final installment of the saga, J.J. Abrams reversed course on as many of the round-headed one's misguided attempts to violate expectations as he could, when any freaking media psychologist on Earth would have told Ryan what an absolutely terrible idea violating expectations in the way he did was. However, JJ's attempts still don't deal with the basic flaws in the sequel trilogy, that we don't have any other characters to care about. As stated, Rey doesn't have enough of a character for any major violation she could make to impact the audience, be it her fearing going to the dark side or anything else she could possibly do. Anything that would cause us to move out of categorizing her as protagonist and into individual attribution. By the time JJ took the helm back, almost all of the main cast of the original trilogy was unusable, either because the actress had passed or because the character had been killed, both of which causes parasocial breakup distress. In a desperate attempt to repair the damage done to Luke's character, in The Rise of Skywalker, Luke aids Rey in ways he refused to do in the previous film. However, as we saw when we looked at parasocial breakups, once a parasocial relationship has been severely damaged or destroyed, people don't care anymore about apologies or attempts to mend it. He acted immorally, and then they killed him. The damage is done. The relationship is over. It was far too little, far too late. For the rest of the characters from the sequel franchise, with perhaps the exception of Kylo, equally lack the kind of complex characterization that allows for attribution over categorization. Thus, any change in their personality or any trials they might face would need be minor enough as to not violate expectations to an extreme degree that would produce dissonance, yet at this point in the franchise, any change that would not produce dissonance would also be too little as to move toward individuation over categorization, particularly when you have so many characters. To explain, let's use the Plinkett test to describe characters from the sequel trilogy.
Describe the following Star Wars character without saying what they looked like, what kind of costume they wore, or what their profession or role in the movie was. Describe this character to your friends like they ain't never seen Star Wars.
Who is Luke Skywalker? Who is Han Solo? Who is Leia Organa? Now think about, in contrast, who is Rey? This is precisely what the data indicated. People didn't change their opinions on Rey because they never had any to begin with. The reason so many people accept the misdeeds of, say, Walter White, or the harsh actions, in the books more so than the show, of my boy Stannis the Manus, first of his name Baratheon, is because we know their various attributes. They don't fall neatly into a box or a category. What are Rey's attributes?
I bypassed the compressor.
In the last film, at the 11th hour, it's simply too late to start establishing any, and to establish any that could be contradicted in any way. And thus the capacity to forge parasocial relationships is minor if it's extant at all. The one character from the sequel trilogy with any real character development and capacity for attribution over categorization, as Bonus et al. Study indicated, was Kylo. And thus it's no wonder that the Reyloads absolutely lost they dang minds, all over Twitter, when that particular parasocial relationship ended in breakup as well. And that leads us to the topic of narrative justice and happy endings. Kylo commits a major moral violation by murdering his father in The Force Awakens, thus some justice is expected, but the problem arises in that Kylo appears to be the only character with enough depth to get one's feet wet, although probably just your feet, don't worry about your socks getting soggy or anything. Thus the equitable justice that might otherwise have been satisfying now involves the one character with seemingly any remaining parasocial impact, producing breakup and ultimately distress in those who did care about him. For the rest of the film, the utter lack of stakes, wherein our heroes, as generic and indescribable as little boxes on a hillside as they are, conveniently find their way from MacGuffin to McMuffin, and everything ends on an ultimately sickeningly happy note. Well, at least for Rey Skywalker, who never faces any challenges, any struggles, or any real sacrifice, unless you count Kylo dying, that lacks any eudaimonia. Death becomes meaningless in the films because it's established early on in Rise of Skywalker that Rey has Force healing, and even the emotional death of C-3PO when his memory is wiped is ultimately meaningless when it's reversed in the conclusion. This ending may be happy, but it lacks any meaning. It lacks eudaimonia, and therefore it does not produce any appreciation or meaningfulness. Additionally, the ending undoes the justice that Palpatine was served in the original trilogy, and when we know people enjoy seeing justice be served, and particularly like and appreciate fair justice, the ending of this film, which overrides the ending of the original trilogy and Anakin's story, ultimately is the antithesis of justice. Some other small elements in the film, such as Chewbacca finally receiving his medal, are such small concessions to a crowd of fans who felt so betrayed as to be meaningless themselves. For me, the only moments of the film I enjoyed were the small elements that did evoke some parasocial feelings of closeness, such as when Lando and Chewie are reunited and when Chewie breaks down after learning about Leia's passing. What this indicates to me, though, is that the only character you have left in this story with any complexities of attribution enough to produce a parasocial feeling of interaction is the giant Furby who speaks Trebonics.
I speak for the trees, and the trees speak Vietnamese.
Taken together, here's why the Star Wars trilogy failed, and why it's now being lambasted by pretty much everyone. No character attributes were established in the first film that would allow them to fall outside of neat, simplistic categorization. Rey, Finn, and Poe are all just heroes. Finn had some potential, but it's dropped, and nothing he does outside of his initial defection from the First Order would cause us to question his explicit category as generic hero figure and move into more individuated understanding of him. Offhand remarks from Zori Bliss about Poe's background and his very logical decision to not heed the recommendations of Admiral Gender Studies are similarly not enough to really individuate Poe as anything but generic hero. And finally, we come to Rey, our protagonist, who lacks any individuating factors other than being Space Jesus who can solve any problem and is never in any real danger, which again does not produce a meaningful narrative, nor one that people really like. Let's contrast, though, to Superman, a character often called a Gary Stu due to also being something of a space Jesus. And while comics aren't a great example because each writer handles each character differently, for this, I want to take a look at the example of All-Star Superman, written by Grant Morrison, that revolves around Superman slowly dying of radiation poisoning. Superman, essentially a god, spends every last second of his remaining time alive not to cure his disease, but to save Earth and show his love to Lois Lane, because what individuates Superman, his attributes, at least in his more well-written stories, is that despite being a god, what Supes values most, what he most wants to be, is not a god but a man, Clark Kent. He sees the good in humanity despite all of our faults and sacrifices himself and his own happiness to protect that belief in goodness. Without individuating factors, characters are just roles, they're just categories, boxes to be processed heuristically. When we don't see characters as individuated, we don't really feel parasocially connected to them. The characters who are individuated, such as Han, Luke, and Leia, are all either killed off, resulting in parasocial breakup and distress, or have very little to do with what would grow and develop them in a manner that is not a violation of expectations within our latitude of acceptance. And as I've explicated, we can have a pretty wide latitude of acceptance for character behavior. Finally, the films lack any meaning-making due to Rey's infallibility, and as a result, while a happy ending may make some feel good, ultimately when there's no sacrifice, no struggle, no stakes, the plot lacks eudaimonia. Our protagonists joke with one another in Rise of Skywalker while they're supposedly about to be killed, and who cares if they are killed when every death in the film can be rectified by Rey, even if the deaths had not been fake-outs, such as in the case of Chewbacca or C-3PO. Characters need to form the backbone of your story, particularly when we know how we feel about characters. And by destroying parasocial relationships, which causes psychological distress, already the audience is going to be unhappy. This can even be expanded to a macro level of parasocial breakup distress when we consider the dissolution of the expanded universe of Star Wars. You killed the entire universe. No wonder you pissed the fans off. Without other characters or relationships to form bonds with, there is no potential replacement for the breakups that do occur, and without struggle, there is no meaning to be made from watching the film. For these reasons, on every single basic level, the Skywalker saga is a cinematic failure for the viewer's psyche and should serve as a testament on why violating expectations, while it can work, is not inherently a good thing, and probably usually a bad one. But hey, what do you guys think? I know everyone has strong opinions on Star Wars, and emotions have been quite high regarding this film franchise. For, as I hope I have shown, good reason when we view these characters as our friends, and those friendships can be so powerful to our emotional state. For those reasons, I felt it imperative to try and remove some of those feelings from the discussion and replace them with a bit more fact, or at least more theory and psych research. Did you feel betrayed by these films? Did you feel betrayed by characters like Luke? Can you individuate any of the characters from the sequel trilogy in the way you might be able to do for Han, Luke, or Leia? Except maybe Kylo. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. As always, a huge, enormous thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon, Subscribestar, and Streamlabs. You guys really allow me to keep making this kind of content. Additionally, I'm sorry for how long it took for me to get this video out. If you guys haven't been able to tell from the sound of my voice throughout this recording, I've had tonsillitis and the flu for the better part of a month, actually nearly a month now, and before Aiden has coronavirus. But thank you guys for your patience. I'm finally on the mend, so hopefully videos will be coming out a little bit faster going forward. After about 2 weeks of realizing I wasn't going to get much work done any individual day, I kind of adopted a it's January vibe anyway. But again, thank you guys for your patience. And as always, dear friends, Diftor Hismusma. Wait, that's not right. That's Star Trek, not Star Wars. As always, guys, Altana Volt.